Ani, hello. My name is Samantha Brennan, and I'm originally from Port Colborne in the Niagara region. I am mostly of Celtic, Germanic, and Norse heritage, and I've been living on the island and working with the Bajamajig for almost 7 years now. I started out as a student in the 3-year Community Arts Animator program, and during that time, among other things, I was trained to some extent in all aspects of theatre production. So I have been experiencing Indigenous, non-Indigenous theatre collaboration for as long as I've been here at the Bajamajig. I've played one role or another in over 15 original Debajamajig productions, as well as playing technical roles in outside pieces being presented at Debajamajig, such as Janny Lozen's A Side of Dreams. I was a creative assistant, assistant director, lighting designer, and technician, set designer, and projectionist for Leslie Carlane's Are They Thinking of Me?, which Debajamajig helped to bring from the page to the stage. A few notable non-native organizations we work with are the Northern Ontario School of Medicine, Laurentian School of Architecture, and Divest Waterloo. I could go on and on all day listing our experiences with Indigenous, non-Indigenous theatre collaborations, but let's move on. For me, things here at Debajamajig developed very naturally. As a student, I was gifted with outstanding teachers, and with their help, I was able to absorb their theatrical knowledge by assisting them with their responsibilities until they thought I was ready to fly on my own. Developing these skills over the course of 3 years really set me up with everything I needed to become a staple staff member when it comes to creating, producing, and presenting theatre. As a non-native person working in an Indigenous theatre company, constantly creating new works, Indigenous, non-Indigenous collaboration is a huge part of my work. Whether I'm using my voice to contribute to creation and performance, or taking a step back to inhabit a behind-the-scenes role, I'm constantly collaborating with my colleagues to bring stories to the stage and screen. First and foremost, I want to share that there is no one way or right way to go about this type of collaboration. The best way will vary and will depend on the type of project, the specific people who are involved and the roles they are fulfilling, the land you are on and the specific social situations encountered there, the strength of the atmosphere of safety, and so much more. As a wise man named Darren McGregor once said to me, the important thing is to remember to do it in a good way. If you're doing it in a good way, that's the right way. So instead of presenting you with a hard, written-in-stone list of what to do and what not to do, today I am simply going to share with you what we at Debajamajig have learned so far in our experiences with Indigenous, non-Indigenous theatre collaboration. I hope this can be helpful to those of you who are seeking out these types of collaborations. My hope is that you can take the knowledge being shared here today and apply the parts of it that are helpful to you in whatever way is best for the project you're working on. You can also feel free to share any of this accumulated knowledge with anyone you think it may be useful to. I'd like to start off by talking a little bit about why we believe Indigenous, non-Indigenous theatre collaboration is important. One of the things that first got me thinking about disseminating some of this knowledge is the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which highlights the importance of collaboration. The 83rd call to action in the Commission goes like this. We call upon the Canada Council for the Arts to establish, as a funding priority, a strategy for Indigenous and non-Indigenous artists to undertake collaborative projects and produce works that contribute to the reconciliation process. Canada Council has responded arguably well to this call to action and have created quite a few funding initiatives that have supported some amazing projects. Most importantly for us creators, this call to action is calling on us to reach out to one another and collaborate to create works that move reconciliation forward. The TRC acknowledges the impact that collaborative artistic works can have on reconciliation, not only for the people involved in the project, but also for audience members and participants. We at Debajamajig have seen these impacts firsthand and agree wholeheartedly that continuing down this collaborative path is a step in the right direction towards reconciliation. We agree because we know that art is intrinsically healing for the mind, heart, body, and spirit. At Debajamajig, we acknowledge the need for healing as a first and ongoing step towards reconciliation. We must first reconcile with the self before we can reconcile with each other. We're going to touch on that a bit more later in the presentation. Art and creation provide a platform for individual healing as well as collective healing. This platform has a great potential to connect people to themselves and each other, to create and nurture healthy relationships within and outside of our own communities. The arts foster understanding between the artists and the audience, between peoples of different nations, and the arts help us to express things that we may find too difficult to express with words. These are all elements which move us towards greater appreciation, understanding, and friendship in one another, and therefore help in the process of reconciliation. I would also like to take a moment to acknowledge that, although many Indigenous people are doing incredible work to move reconciliation forward, the work of reconciliation is not the burden of Indigenous people. In the last 5 years, I have become more aware of the boatloads of emotional labor that are dumped on Indigenous shoulders by well-intentioned settlers posing questions. Reconciliation should not be an emotional, physical, or spiritual burden on Indigenous people. That responsibility sits squarely on the shoulders of settlers. Therefore, I call on all of my settler colleagues to make an effort every single day to work towards reconciliation with Indigenous communities. Artistic collaboration is a great opportunity to contribute to this work while lifting up Indigenous artists and their voices. With that said, let's move on to the first section, laying a foundation for cross-cultural collaboration. In the last few decades, we have seen a lot of controversy in the art world where Native and non-Native artists cross paths. From casting non-Native actors to portray Native roles, to claiming Indigenous ancestry where there is none, to collaborations that turn out to be very one-sided, to straight-up appropriation of sacred and familial images. Although these blunders are great examples of what not to do, in the spirit of moving forward together in a good way, I would like to acknowledge the artists who are creating positive examples of successful collaborations between Native and non-Native artists. I truly believe that these collaborations are a real tangible step towards reconciliation. I will now share some of Debajimajig's experience-based learning and how successful collaborations can be nurtured. First part, check yourself. Are you ready? Non-Natives in Canada are often surprised by how culture shocked they are when first introduced to Indigenous peoples and communities. In my time at Debajimajig, I oversaw our volunteer program, which over 3 years brought in more than 120 people from all over the world to help us in our land-based programming. One would think that our international volunteers would have the hardest time adjusting to an environment rich with an Anishinaabe culture, but it was actually the Canadian volunteers who were the most challenged by it. Perhaps this is because they grew up hearing about First Nations people but never visited a community or interacted with anyone Indigenous. This goes to show that in Canada, we are still dealing with an education gap on the real history of Canada in Canadian public schools, and a very real divide that begins on the border of each reservation. This is the reality of the legacy of our settler ancestors. Part 2, do your homework. Before collaborating, put some effort into researching past collaborations and information on Indigenous, non-Indigenous relations. Since the TRC, many studies, documents, and seminars relating to these topics have been executed. A Google search for reconciliation theater projects or reconciliation art projects will pull up a slew of completed projects. You can also check out the projects funded through Canada Council for the Arts Reconciliation Funding Initiative on the Canada Council website. Music Eddies has produced some very helpful works as well, one called Towards Braiding and the other called Scarring Our Collective Soul Wound, which can both be found in full for free on the Music Eddies website. It would also be wise to educate yourself on some historical happenings that underpin Indigenous, non-Indigenous relationships in Canada, such as the Oka Crisis, Project Rainbow, and Canadian residential schools. There are also some more contemporary issues that would be helpful to be educated on, such as the Wet'suwet'en pipeline conflict and what's happening right now out east between Indigenous lobster fishermen and non-Indigenous commercial fishermen. Part 3, be honest with yourself. Any anger, racism, or prejudice that you hold will be reflected in your work and can easily tear apart an otherwise good-intentioned collaboration. Before you seek collaboration, there may be some inner work to do in order to approach the project with a clean and open heart and mind. Take a look inside and be extremely honest with yourself about whether or not you are holding negative emotions that will impact your work and your relationship with your collaborators. I'm not saying that anger, racism, or prejudice may not have a part to play in the finished work of art, as these themes can be very important to highlight. However, they should have no place in the way that we treat each other during collaboration. Part 4, reconciliation with self. At Debajimajig, we have discussed the reconciliation process thoroughly, and we often land in agreement that in order to have reconciliation as a nation, we must first reconcile with ourselves. I think this is extremely important to consider when collaborating cross-culturally. Personally, I only started producing my best work at Debajimajig after I had taken steps to reconcile with myself and my ancestors. Even though we are a cross-cultural company, I found that I could not be fully open to the teachings or my Indigenous colleagues or feel a sense of belonging without first shifting my focus inwards and moving beyond the denial of I didn't do anything to hurt Indigenous people, it's not my fault, to accepting the guilt that many non-natives feel for their complicity with the actions of the government against Indigenous people and for their ancestors' complicity or direct action in causing harm to Indigenous people and communities, to forgiveness of self and ancestors for their action or inaction. Denial, acceptance, forgiveness is one of the diamond teachings associated with the legend of the oak tree, the third of the Odawa Medewan historical teachings. In essence, the oak tree is a representation of the self, and the roots represent our life experiences and the life experiences of our ancestors. That includes all of our experiences, the good, the bad, and the ugly. The teachings tell us that it is important to really take a look at all of them, not just the good ones that are easy to recall. The most important experiences to look at are the nasty ones, because they indicate there is work to be done. When we start to look at these nasty experiences, we tend to automatically slip into denial in order to protect ourselves from any bad feelings. Denial can be as simple as thinking, if only I had done things differently, or as complicated as absolving yourself of responsibility in order to feel better. There will always be an underlying nasty feeling until you can move on to acceptance. When you can be completely honest with yourself and accept what you have done or what has happened to you, you can begin to forgive yourself or your assailants for their wrongdoing. When you begin to forgive, you begin to heal and can finally see this experience for what it is now, something to learn from so that you don't make the same mistakes in the future. Next, being honest about who we are. When it comes to this subject, there are some great opportunities to learn from the mistakes of others. In the last few years, there has been some news coverage of people who have claimed Indigenous ancestry, produced work based on that ancestry, and then been found to have little or no Indigenous ancestry whatsoever. Their previously successful work becomes virtually irrelevant and frowned upon by both Native and non-Native communities. First of all, those people have missed out on a great chance for collaboration. Secondly, it is downright wrong to claim to be someone you are not, especially claiming to be part of a marginalized population without understanding whatsoever their struggles. Not to mention taking opportunities from people who are underrepresented with limited platforms for their work. Native or non-Native, we do not have to hide our heritage, and at the end of the day, we get the most out of being honest about it. Being proud of and knowing your heritage gives others permission to do so, and connects us all to our land-based roots on this earth that we share, where we can easily see eye to eye and collaborate from a place of understanding with each other. The bottom line is, if we can't contribute anything as who we are, we should not contribute. Now that we've built a foundation within ourselves to move towards cross-cultural collaboration, let's talk about setting some ground rules for the collaboration process. We have learned through previous collaborations that it is a healthy practice to identify some ground rules as a starting place. First, establishing a directive. It is helpful to create a directive to refer to periodically throughout the collaboration to keep everyone on track and to give everyone the opportunity to hold themselves and each other accountable to the work. The directive can include the vision and mandate for the project and any other details that the group wants to keep as a way to stay grounded to the purpose of the work. The directive may take the form of a short statement or even a list of points. It can be used as often as the group feels necessary, daily, weekly, etc. Next, negotiating a process. Before creation begins, it is important to take some time to plan a process for creation that all parties agree upon. This may include a day-to-day schedule of activities that includes goals to be reached by the end of each day or week or activity. This negotiation should also include use of cultural tools such as talking circles and smudging, with guidelines on how they should be used. For example, we will have a talking circle with smudge to check in with each other every morning about the project. It will be a safe space to bring up any new thoughts about the show, but reflections on our personal lives should not be included. Next, roles and responsibilities. Establish very clear roles for everyone involved with the project and identify the responsibilities involved with each role for both creation and dissemination. This will make it easier to avoid stepping on each other's toes during the process of creation. It will also eliminate any confusion on who should be doing what and be easier to hold yourselves and each other accountable to your responsibilities. Next, deciding on how final decisions will be reached. Identify the process that will be used for decision making. Do all final decisions fall on one person? And if so, how does that affect collaboration? Is consensus required to make a final decision? Deciding this ahead of time will make all final decisions easier to reach. We've built the foundation and talked about ground rules for collaboration. Now, let's take a look at some helpful hints and tools for collaboration that we have had success with over the years. We'll start with a term that I'm sure many of you have heard before. Nothing about us without us. This not only applies to Indigenous peoples, but can be expanded to include all marginalized populations. Things become sticky if you are a person of privilege, writing or acting from the perspective of people who are not so highly represented in the arts and have a much more difficult time finding a platform for their work. Number 2, don't take what is not yours. If you would not steal someone's wallet or other belongings, why would you take their stories or artwork? Not only would you be taking something that doesn't belong to you, but you may be using it in a completely inappropriate way, stripping it of its meaning and purpose. If you see or experience something you want to use, have the courage and respect to ask. Worst case scenario, the answer will be no, and you've made a new connection by starting a conversation. Number 3, the thinking process, when in doubt. The O'Donnell-Madewan historical teachings give us some really good tools to keep ourselves in check. One of those tools is called the thinking process, and it should be used anytime a decision is being made. I use it in my artistic process constantly when deciding what issues to address, who to include in my projects, and even how to present and what materials to use. It goes like this. What effect will this decision have on the future, 7 generations from now? Will I be making things better for the people yet to come? What effect does this decision have on the past? Will I be letting my ancestors down by making this choice? What effect does this decision have on the present? How will this affect my life and the lives of those around me? And finally, is this decision out of need or out of greed? If it's out of greed, everything else cancels out. Number 4, put your ego away. When we were covering reconciliation with self in the first part of the seminar, we touched on the legend of the oak tree and how it can help us resolve our inner issues. There is another great tool within that legend that can help us during collaborations and throughout our everyday lives. The full legend tracks the development of our ego and also our spiritual development throughout our lives. In essence, what the oak tree teaches us is that our ego is just a tool. That's it, that's all, just a tool. We can pull it out when we need it and put it away when we don't. Our teacher says, we don't need to be cool all the time, just sometimes. In my experience, the ego has no place in creation and collaboration. The ego needs 3 things to survive. It needs to be able to control, predict, and defend. If you're spending your time trying to control the project and the people involved, predict things that might hurt your ego, and defend your ego against your collaborators, you are not going to have a very successful collaboration. The teachings also tell us that the ego covers up the true self, like the leaves covering an oak tree. It is extremely difficult to open yourself up to contributing creatively if you're trying to be cool or hide the true you. If you are genuine and honest with your group, you have nothing to hide. The only time we would need to pull out our ego is when our values are being compromised. In that case, your ego is there to protect those values and can be used in a gentle way to do so. Number 5, pass the mic. This should go without saying, but it is important that each person involved in the collaboration has a voice that is heard by the others. Each person who is part of the creation process is there for a reason and should be listened to. Furthermore, suggestions should be discussed and decided upon in a clear way so that everyone stays on the same page. Number 6, safety, vulnerability, and openness. The creative process can often bring out the vulnerability of the artist. Collaborating creatively means you must be open to your fellow artists in a vulnerable situation. Hesitation and fear can be big obstacles. This should be acknowledged and steps should be taken to ensure that each creator feels safe to dive as deep as necessary. Number 7, ensure proper acknowledgement. It is important to acknowledge not only the artists with whom you collaborate, but also those who contributed to your work in other ways. If one of your stories came from your grandmother's childhood, if you received a drum song or teachings that you include in your work, if someone provided materials or even food for your creative team, those folks contributed to the work, and should be honored and acknowledged. Since I've been with the Bajamajig, I often use Indigenous knowledge or ways of doing in order to create my work. Therefore, my teachers contribute to my artwork in their own way, and I credit them appropriately. Speaking of which, I would like to acknowledge the collective work of my colleagues at the Bajamajig for their contributions to this presentation. I would also like to thank David Ozawa-Bennett for sharing with us the Odawa Madewan teachings, which we use constantly in our work, including in this presentation. Number 8, be genuine and generous. This is a great term to live by in general, but especially applies when you're asking to learn about Indigenous culture as a non-native. It is important to make sure that if you want to receive something, you are genuinely interested for the right reasons. You must also make sure not to take without giving something in return. Reciprocity is key to a healthy relationship. Number 9, don't be afraid to ask. The fear of looking ignorant often stops people from asking questions that might actually help them learn something. Don't let that be a roadblock in your collaboration. And that's it for my presentation on Indigenous, non-Indigenous theater collaboration. It has been an honor and a pleasure to present to you today, and I'm really looking forward to the Q&A session so I can hear your thoughts on this work. Miigwech, Bamapi, Miwakawapman.